Okay, at least I'll get my part started anyway. Afternoon, everybody. Welcome to ICLR's Friday Forum for Friday, June 30th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Managing Director Glenn McGilvery. I'm filling in for Keith Porter today. Keith unfortunately wasn't able to make it. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other useful information related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. And we've been offering these webinars for a good long time now, not quite 25 years, but pretty close to it. Last time we brought you a couple of representatives from the California Earthquake Authority who spoke about seismic retrofit for older wood frame homes. So the slides and the link to the video replay are both available on our website, iclr.org/workshops. We'll also endeavor to get the slides and the link to this session up on our site probably Tuesday, given that Monday is a holiday. Next time around on July 14th, we'll have representatives who will speak about developing a coherent flood forecasting framework for Canada. But today's topic is earthquake. So today's speaker, Ayse Hortacsu of the Applied Technology Council, will tell us what she saw when she visited the epicentral region of the February 2023 earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. Dr. Porter invited Ayse, and he tells me that he's known, admired, and collaborated with her for many years on a variety of earthquake resilience projects. She is a structural engineer, serving as Director of Projects at the Applied Technology Council. ATC is America's leading applied research organization, specializing in reducing engineering risk in natural disasters. Ayse manages projects, conducts post-earthquake field reconnaissance, and leads several professional engineering committees. She's originally from Turkey, although from the opposite end as the part that suffered from these horrible quakes. And so with no further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Ayse. And go ahead. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you everyone for your attention to this earthquake that happened now almost 5 months ago. And I was one of the earliest teams from the United States on the field. And this is actually my 20th presentation, and I'm delighted every time I'm asked to speak, because we have to keep learning and we have to keep growing our knowledge base from this terrible disaster. We can't just forget about it. As Glenn mentioned, I'm originally from Turkey, and actually I am from the other side of the country of Istanbul, and Istanbul region actually had a major earthquake in 1999. And that earthquake actually found me while I was still in California. And I was an undeclared engineering student at Stanford University, didn't really know what type of engineering to do. And then the 1999 earthquake happened. And that's when I got to travel to Turkey for the first time as a member of a reconnaissance team. And then at that point, I vowed to, fix this earthquake problem. Unfortunately, it's been 24 years, and that is what I've been working on for the last 24 years. But we haven't quite gotten there. I'm hoping that in the remaining 25 years of my career, we really will reduce these catastrophic losses from earthquakes. Just a quick briefing on Turkey. It's definitely, really far away on the other side of the world. And what Turkey is really special for is that over centuries, millennia, it's always been this bridge between Asia and Europe. It's a place where cultures came together, languages came together, religions came together. And it's also a place where continental plates come together. And when they come together, they have a little party. They're always rubbing against each other and causing quakes in Turkey. So as you can see, the epicentral region for this earthquake in February was in the southeast. And the first earthquake that occurred at 4 in the morning was of magnitude 7.8. So imagine the magnitude of that, followed by 9 hours later by another earthquake of magnitude 7.5. And this actually shows all of the earthquakes larger than magnitude 5 in Turkey since 1900. So it is a place that has been very tectonically active its entire time. So the earthquake hazard is really well known in Turkey. This is satellite imagery from the February earthquakes showing displacement of the Earth as seen from satellites. So red indicates 4 meters of movement in one direction, and the dark blue is another 4 meters in the other direction. So again, try to imagine Earth moving sideways and up and down 4 meters in these earthquakes. I had the opportunity to be deployed by the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute that is headquartered in California as a member of the advanced team to respond to the earthquake. Me and a colleague, and we were also accompanied by the geotechnical extreme events reconnaissance team. So there was 2 of them and 2 of us, 4 of us were on the ground within a week of the earthquake. And we started collecting information, not necessarily detailed, measurements and things like that, but to get a hold of what is going on in this really large region that was affected by the earthquakes. And another activity that EERI undertook right away was to establish a virtual clearinghouse. And this clearinghouse is still up on the EERI website and will remain up. And what they have on this website available is the report that our teams produced, as well as recordings of detailed webinars that pertain to lifelines, hospitals, buildings, and geotechnical impacts. Because as I mentioned, I was part of the advanced team, and then based on our guidance, EERI and GEAR deployed additional teams to the field. So another total of 5 teams with specific focus on these topics traveled to Turkey in the months of March and April. So all of their more detailed findings are to be found in this report and the webinars. And I've definitely tried to bring forward information from these more recent travels into my presentation for you today as well. In addition, I also want to let you know that the Canadian Association for Earthquake Engineering also deployed a team in the month of May with 12 team members, and an additional 2 traveled in June. And I've been informed that they are also working on a report. They've done a lot of observations of the transportation network and dams, as well as structural observations, just like we did with the EERI team. The highlight from our colleagues in this CAEE is that the transportation network did perform really well. All of the roads in the region were being used within 36 hours. There were about, I believe, 3 collapses and 15 moderate damage to abutments, etc. But all of those roads were being used within 36 hours. So the transportation networks did really well in Turkey, as well as the dams. They said there were some observed damage, but no dams really lost their water. So before I start, I want to share some acknowledgements. Again, I was on the field for about a week, but then I actually also got to spend an additional 2 weeks and also another week last week in Turkey talking to experts in the earthquake design and seismology areas. And I was also, of course, informed by many of the other teams that traveled to the region. The limitations to my observations today are, my own observations were on the field for 7 days. I am a structural engineer, not a geotech or seismologist or a social scientist. And I also sadly want to acknowledge that we have very limited information from Syria. Okay, field observations. So again, as I mentioned, Turkey has a very known high hazard from earthquakes. And this is the Turkey seismic hazard map. And because of that, there is a really dense network of recording stations. This is only showing the ones that are in the region, but there are over 700 ground motion recording stations in Turkey. And this is a shake map that was produced by the USGS. So as you can see, there's a definitely concentration near the epicentral region. And we use these stations as our wayfinding points. The team at home, as we were on the road driving 1,000 miles in 7 days, they would provide us information such as this. Go to the city of Nurda, where there's a ground motion station available. And from satellite maps, they would find us where that station is located. And then from additional pre-post information that a lot of satellite companies did produce, they were able to direct us to the damaged areas. So as we were traveling, we would direct our driver to say, okay, go to this area because we want to see moderate damage, and go to this area so that we can see the collapsed buildings. Again, our goal was to collect general information about where lies the perishable information that follow-on teams should travel to and collect. Overall, of course, as you know, it was a devastating earthquake. The official numbers are at about 50,000 casualties. However, if you ask me, that number must be a lot higher, because if you look at the rest of the information, which is that 15% of the buildings out of almost 2 million, so about 230,000 buildings were heavily damaged, collapsed, or had to be demolished. And considering that a lot of these buildings were multi-family apartment buildings, the real number might be higher. But again, the official number stands at 50,000. The 1999 earthquake that I mentioned in Istanbul, that was a 7.4. The official casualty numbers were capped at about 20,000, and the unofficial numbers are at about double that. So let's think about that for a minute. The damage is estimated, again, by this official government report as to be $100 billion. And this is only considering the physical replacement and repair costs, and does not include potential damage to commercial and business and other types of interruption. The building occupancy is something I want to draw your attention to before we start, because the primary buildings in Turkey are residential. So especially in these cities, there were 11 cities affected in the earthquake. They were major cities, but they're not as major as Istanbul or Ankara. So they really didn't have these, skyscrapers and big downtown areas that were purely commercial. Instead, a lot of the buildings look alike, and you'll see many pictures of them, and a lot of them are residential. So there were about 14 million people affected in the earthquake region, residing in 2.6 million buildings. And the results of the analysis says that housing for about 2.7 million people were affected. So again, that is a really large number of people. Their shelter, their home has been affected. And of course, immediately after the earthquake, there was a huge diaspora out of the earthquake region. So the gray region is where the earthquake was effects were felt, and then red is where people were traveling to. This snapshot is from about 2 weeks after the earthquake, showing that over 1 million people traveled out of the area, staying with relatives and other shelter areas. They opened a lot of college, university dorms for displaced residents and things like that. Typical construction in Turkey hasn't changed much over the years. This is an older building, and this is a new building under construction. It's a combination of reinforced concrete frames with unreinforced hollow clay tiles. This is basically the type of construction you will find in almost all of the buildings in Turkey, unless they're very modern, very tall, and have larger resources. The typical damage that we saw is kind of quickly summarized in this slide. This is a building that has this big red Y on it. It's standing up, but the Y indicates that it will be demolished. It's because these areas, all at the bottom of every column that was supporting this 5 or 6 story building, had plastic hinging, which means that the building has moved so much that the reinforcement has either broken or yielded, and it will never hold the building up again. So this building will certainly be demolished. This building is leaning so much to the side due to the soft story that is occurring on the first 2 floors of the building. This building over here has a very typical damage pattern where the unreinforced hollow clay tile walls have fallen out. So that's, even if this building was structurally safe, the damage to the walls are very, very scary to the inhabitants. And we've also seen some of them inside where you can see from your living room into your bedroom, right? And it's really hard to tell these people that this building is okay. All you have to do is fix that wall, because a lot of them, of course, believe that these walls are weight bearing. And if they are weight bearing, they have cracks. So how are they going to hold my building up? But in most of the cases in Turkey, these walls, all of the clay, hollow clay walls are not weight bearing, they're non-structural. This picture is actually of a school. In general, the schools in Turkey performed really well, which was ironic because the earthquake was at 4 in the morning. So if the earthquake had actually happened during the day when the kids were in school, many lives would have been spared. This is the only school that we saw with damage, and I've done some further research into other performance of buildings, school buildings overall, and there really are very few examples of catastrophic damage to school buildings. This one had the damage, and the reason I'm highlighting it here is that it happened because there's this little corridor connecting two buildings that created a short column effect, and then the two pieces couldn't move together, and that caused the loss of a story over here. The buildings team from EERI that traveled, they actually did some more quantifiable research, and they actually visited 91 residential buildings. All of them had heavy or moderate damage. Of course, they weren't looking at ones that were completely rubble, and they were trying to focus their work on post-2000 buildings, because since the 1999 earthquake, Turkey has tried to modernize their building code and building construction. So our team was trying to focus on kind of the better case of buildings in Turkey. And what they found was that the primary reason for damage was rebar buckling. Those are the plastic hinges we talked about. Concrete crushing, again, when the steel cannot hold the concrete together, and more plastic hinging. So this is an example of that. For example, we can tell that this building is post-2000 because they are using deformed bars. Prior to 1999, that was almost non-existent in Turkey. They would use smooth bars. And again, in the 1999 earthquake, we saw many cases of the smooth bars simply pulling out of the concrete. So this is a modern building, but the confinement was still not adequate, and the building moved so much that it could not support itself. In addition to structural damage, we also saw many evidences of geotechnical impacts. This is a building where the structural engineer did their work well, but the geotech didn't. This building is located in the city of Gölbaşı, which actually means head of a lake. It's like side of a lake. This is on a city that is on a dry lake bed near a river, so there's a lot of liquefaction that happened, and it was very much expected, and the foundation of this building was not adequate. What I also want to draw your attention to is over here. Basically, if you could zoom in, you could see there are claw marks on this wall out here. So it's very likely that the neighboring residents ran over and broke that wall from the outside so they could get their neighbors out alive. This is another common site we saw in our field studies. And again, this is something that is very perishable and interesting to capture. This was a site of 8 identical buildings, all built by the same contractor, and one of the buildings collapsed. And you can see the smooth bars here. And that was typical practice at the time this building was built, about 40 years ago, so 1980s. But what happened was that because somebody died in this building, the district attorney takes over, and this is a crew that is designated to clear out the rubble so that they could compare all of the individual concrete columns to the as-built drawings that they hope to find with the building department. And if any foul play is suspected, such as somebody wanted to do an open floor plan on the first floor, so they cut out a column, then there would be prosecution. It's one thing to look at these buildings as individual case studies of engineering failures and try to learn from that. But the most impactful thing to me was to see things to look at them in the big picture. This is the city of Kahramanmaraş, and we pulled up here on, I believe, day 2, and this is the center of the city, and this is what we saw. The rubble clearing was ongoing, and of course, after day 2 or 3, unfortunately, we got used to sites like this. What really affected me was that once we returned and did some research, my colleague found a before picture of this exact spot. All of these buildings are either residential or commercial. All of these little panels you see are advertising the offices of a lawyer, a travel agent, a pharmacy, and maybe some apartments as well. And that community is entirely gone now. A couple blocks down, this is the before picture of a shopping area. And those stores are no more. And another thing we need to think about is that what if you are this building and your building is standing up and maybe it's repairable, but what does it mean if all of your neighborhood has been reduced to rubble? So we really need to think about our disasters and our disaster resilience at a community basis, because just because I have a strong building does not guarantee that I will be getting business and I will be happily living in that building forever if I don't have any neighbors. This is the even bigger picture of the Kahramanmaraş city. So what you saw in the downtown core was devastating damage, complete rubble. However, those hillsides that were built later on better soil were actually in much better shape. There's a lot of brand new 10, 12-story apartment buildings, and we went into some of them with very low damage or no damage. Next, I want to share with you the story of 4 hospitals, again in the city of Kahramanmaraş. So we have one hospital that is inside. This is inside the city, up on the hills. There's one hospital that is in the center of the city. And then we have 2 hospitals next to each other in this town, in this outskirts, where they're trying to consolidate all of their health care. Oh, there you go. So the first hospital we visited was up a winding road, up on the hills, did not look very good from the outside, a little shabby, but we got to talk to the hospital director. This is day 10 after the earthquake, and he told us right away that they did not really lose any operations because their backup systems were operational. So they had water and power. They did not have gas from the main, but he said they were able to heat the rooms with electricity. And they were able to continue operations after the first shock at 4 a.m. Of course, if you can imagine, there were, I believe, 17,000 heavily damaged buildings in the city. So that equals to a lot of patients. So there was lines out the door around the block, and they were able to service them. Until the second earthquake came 9 hours later at 1 p.m. And even the staff said, oh my God, I'm going to go home. I cannot stay here. So they lost operations. However, the official assessors did not arrive in time, but a professor of engineering who immediately traveled to his hometown of Maraş came by, looked at the building and said, it's good, low hazard, low damage, you guys can go and continue operations. So that was really, really crucial. And they were able to serve 300 patients, at least that's a 300-bed hospital. They were able to continue operations. On the other hand, in the middle of the city, kind of similar, near the area with the commercial district, there was a private hospital that lost an entire story here. And here's a little bit close up of the damage. And that's of course, a patient room that you do not want to be in. In the outskirts, as I mentioned, they are building a hospital facility. So they already had one hospital that was 10 years old. And next to it, they're building an entirely new hospital with the hopes of kind of consolidating the healthcare out of the city itself. And this hospital is one of the 11 that are being built in Turkey on base isolators. So I believe in 2016, there was a new law passed that said every government hospital larger than a certain size has to be on isolators. That is, not a small ask, but all of those hospitals did very well after the earthquake. So this one, of course, was under construction, but even then they were telling us that none of the scaffolding fell over in the earthquake. In contrast, right next to it, so same shaking, same soil, is a hospital that was built only 10 or 12 years ago. And on day 10, this hospital was not serving patients. And that's mostly because they were afraid of the non-structural walls, this fancy tiles falling in the atrium. There was a lot of ceiling damage in the building. They also had some fire in their mechanical room. And we saw there was actually a little bit of structural damage in the corner up here on the 3rd floor, I believe. And that is some damage that should be looked into. But what you can do is you can just cordon off a wing of the hospital and you could use the hospital. But this amount of rubble just causes too much dust for operation rooms. It really caused fear in the staff, so they could not serve their patients. Another reason they couldn't serve is because a hospital cannot function without hygiene. They lost water from the main, so they had to rely on their backup water. But what happened was that this water tank just sloshed around, hit a wall on this side and hit the wall on the back side and dumped out all of the water that had been in this tank. As also the valve, this is probably one of the only pipes that comes out of it, and that one also pulled out, and you can still see it's a little wet. So even if the hospital was able to function, they wouldn't have water and they couldn't provide hygiene. So this was unfortunately a very typical case. What we saw, this building, 10 years old, no apparent structural damage from the outside, but they were serving the community from a field hospital. The hospital team that came back has some statistics on that. They looked at, I believe, 30 hospitals, and I think something like 75% of them were not functioning at full capacity, even after 6 weeks from the earthquake. And this is all due to non-structural components. Now we're going to move south. We were up here in Kahramanmaraş, which was closer to up here was the second epicenter. This is Kahramanmaraş is in the middle, and now we're going to continue going south to Antakya. This is a city that you may have seen in the news. This is a really historically significant city that, again, has brought together cultures and religions and languages together for millennia. And the shaking here was really, really high. The seismological knowledge we have that we use in all of our structural analysis to date has very limited number of earthquakes that have shaking this high. Here's a quick video I want to share with you. This is just us driving in the car with my phone just pasted into the window as we just drive down a random street in Antakya. And I like showing this just to give you a feel for what it is like to be on the field. Again, it's not just about one building. It's not about one column. It's about building after building after building that has severe damage. Even the buildings that are standing up, many of them just are not safe for occupation. And then in addition to that, you have to think about the psychological effects and say a lot of these people are not going to want to go back into these buildings. I actually spoke to our Canadian engineering colleagues who were there most recently, and she said in this part of the earthquake region, the demolition was still ongoing because, again, they're trying to take down all the rubble and all of the heavily damaged buildings as well. So it's going to be a really long time to recover from this. Again, this is, I believe this video is 4 minutes long. I have 5 of these, so 20 minutes just out of one side of our car. My colleague has the 20 minutes from the other side of the window. And this is just one street. So you have to imagine how this would multiply street after street in the city of Antakya. That said, we did find a good-looking street a couple blocks off, and we said, okay, let's walk this street up and down. These buildings look like they're pretty new and in pretty good shape. However, later on, I was able to find the data set of damage assessments, and all of these buildings that you just saw here are marked as heavily damaged. And in this case, that means they're very likely going to be demolished. And then I realized why. I mean, we couldn't really tell very much just driving by the street. And then I zoomed in on this photo that we took. This person living on the 3rd floor could not exit the regular way, right? When we talk about life safety, providing life safety in our designs, that includes safe egress out of a building. This person on the 3rd floor, probably everybody else above them, decided we cannot exit. Likely there was a crushing in the staircase, or the doors were blocked, so they had to get out with their sheets. So of course it makes sense that this building is marked as heavily damaged. Here's another satellite map that shows every red outlined square shape is basically the satellite or the AI chatbot indicating that this is likely a collapsed area. So just the number of red in this historic town is devastating. And the collapse, of course, also includes heavy damage to historical monuments. This spot has been a place of worship since the 7th century. There were a couple good lessons to learn. This is a retrofitted building that we got to see in Antakya. This is block A2. It was built in 1980, and then in 2000, it received some funding to receive a retrofit. So there are these shear walls that they put on the outside, about 6 to 8 of them. This is block A1 that did not have that retrofit, but it did undergo some minor level of improvements in the year of 2000. And block A3 is right in front of you. It has been reduced to rubble. The block A2 also inside had some fiber reinforced wraps around the columns and walls. Unfortunately, my colleagues who went inside, I advised them against going in, indicated that some of these columns were actually cut. So in the 20 years since the retrofit was put in place, unfortunately, modifications were made that reduced the efficacy of this work. Lifelines. In this one here, I'm going to share a quote with you from our friends in Europe. The EFIT team says Hatay, this is basically Antakya, had its bones broken in pieces. It's because they lost water and electricity for 5 or more days. They lost most of their hospitals. So what else are you supposed to do? You can't get support from the outside because everybody else is in a similar shape, and you cannot help yourself. And this is really, really devastating. They found that the main fire station in Antakya collapsed on top of 3 fire engines and 1 search and rescue vehicle. Of course, this was helpful in saving the lives of the firefighters who were running into their trucks. The trucks held up the building, but they couldn't use the critical equipment they need to help their community. So again, it's a very important thing to remember, right? There are some critical functions that are served by specific buildings. So we have to put extra special care in them, both for the lives of the people who work there, but also the services that these critical buildings support. Damage assessments, as we saw, there's a lot of buildings that needed to tell the occupants and tell the jurisdiction whether they're safe to enter or not. You might be familiar with ATC 20. This is the methodology that my organization, ATC, developed right before the Loma Prieta earthquake. So that is what is used very far and wide, definitely in the US and internationally. And we all get trained, and we have our cards that we carry, and we post buildings red, yellow, or green. In Turkey, they took a slightly different path, and they decided to upgrade it to new modern technology and had these stickers. This was only in the city of Kahramanmaraş. They had these stickers with QR codes that you're supposed to scan to find out the safety of your building. But I do want to point out to you, think about how you use a QR code. You have to walk up really close to it and take a picture. And you have to have internet connectivity and a website that works to be able to provide you this information. So I'm going to argue that just putting a red placard that people can see from far away is a lot safer, so that they don't get they don't have something fall on their head as they're approaching this QR code. On the other hand, the letter on the right is a demolition order for a historic building, and this one has 3 wet signatures. I cannot imagine how much time it takes to actually prepare this as well. So it's, to me, these are two extremes of high tech and very low tech. We also saw a lot of appeals pasted on the walls of buildings, people saying, you gave us low hazard, low damage, but no one came into the building. So we demand an engineering evaluation. And this makes sense because I found this map, this only shows about 270,000 damage assessments, but the official report says 1.7 million buildings were inspected in, I believe, a month, within a month of the earthquake, with X number of inspectors. I did the math and it comes out down to 5 minutes per building. And you saw how big these buildings are. They're about, half a block wide. So by the time you walk from one end to the building to the other and punch it into your little handheld device, that is the 5 minutes. And that explains why all these people are complaining that you didn't come into my building, you didn't spend enough time. So that's another thing to think about, is that quick and is good, but it has to have some level of accuracy with it so that it's useful to us. My quick summary of the why of the extent of damage here is I want to draw from a document that actually Keith Porter and I worked on together. This is the FEMA P154 rapid visual screening document. This is meant to help someone with a portfolio of buildings prioritize which buildings have higher seismic hazard than others. So what you would do is you would walk up to your buildings and say, okay, for a given building type, say a concrete building with shear walls, it would give you a basic score. And then for everything that is kind of wrong with it, you would take away points. So I think that is kind of what's happening in Turkey, is that these buildings, if built correctly, they would be able to withstand an earthquake. However, the earthquake was really, really large with severe shaking. And as you will hear in a little bit, and I'm sure you have seen in the news, is that the construction quality, the construction oversight was lacking. So the moment you don't put enough of the steel that it was designed with, the moment you put low quality concrete, the moment you add a soft story and take out a column on the first floor, those things make you really vulnerable. We'll switch gears. A quickly overview of the Turkish earthquake code. This is again from Kahramanmaraş, the area that I was showing the before and afters to you. And in the middle of rubble, a field that has been flattened with rubble, one of the very few buildings that was standing was the Chamber of Civil Engineers. And one block over was the architect. So we clearly know how to design and construct buildings properly. They just needed to do it a lot more times for all of their community. Turkey did not, Turkey's first modern building code is from 1975, but unfortunately Turkey had a really large building boom in the 60s. So this building you see is actually the building of my parents in Istanbul. It was built in 1966, and there just was no knowledge. They were mixing the cement by hand. Again, they didn't have deformed bars. So there's a large building inventory in Turkey right now that was built pre-modern building codes. And the building code was updated in 1998 and in 2018. And the 2018 building code is excellent. I mean, it's very much equivalent to the ASCE, the American code, ASCE 41. It's really detailed, and you get to do all kinds of nonlinear response history analyses if you know how to. So who is responsible? In Turkey, the system is a little different, that the müteahhit, which is basically the developer, takes the responsibility of the contract. It's a very lucrative business, so 450,000 people are registered to act as developers. But there really isn't any real, education or qualifications for it. They did attempt it at some point, and the anecdote is that out of the 70,000 that applied to be classified, 75% of them tested into the lowest level. They do love to put their names on the buildings. I'm assuming that that is going to be a practice that they will stop soon because, again, the responsibility is on them. So following the earthquake, people were finding the people responsible. However, the way they go about it is, especially immediately after the earthquake, this headlines from February 26 was the government was arresting developers. What's that going to do, right? There's 450,000 registered developers, and they arrested, say, a total of 300 by now. That is not really going to change anything. Who designs? Again, this is our picture of our Chamber of Civil Engineers. There are a lot of civil engineering departments in Turkey. There's a lot of private higher education institutes that have been established in Turkey in the last 10 years or so. And every graduate of a 4-year program receives a certificate that allows them to design up to 3 buildings a year. That is in contrast to the United States and I believe in Canada, where I'm required to have experience, apprenticeship, and pass a test after 3 years of working in order to receive my civil engineering license. In Turkey, this system does not exist. They've tried to institute it a couple times, and they were actually struck down by the government courts. Another thing to think about is what tools do they have? What I'm hearing is that because you got to design cheap, build cheap, they are relying on software packages. And this is actually a comic strip put together by the developer of the fancy nonlinear analysis software that we use worldwide. It's called SAP, and it's been developed by Computer Structures International, I believe, CSI. And this comic strip is really interesting. It says, why, what's the question? Why the name SAP, I believe is the question. The slang name SAP was selected to remind the user that this program, like all computer programs, lacks intelligence. It is the responsibility of the engineer to idealize the structure correctly and assume responsibility for the results. Whereas what I'm hearing as common practice in Turkey is that they just take the architectural drawings, put it in this program, which spits out your walls and columns, which we are now finding out is not enough. So what is really lacking in that process is a review process. There was a really interesting article in the New York Times that focused exactly on that. And this quote is mentioning the lack of the licensed engineer and the dedicated engineer for reviewing the projects. And they tried to do it, and again, that system was stopped. So the way the construction process works in Turkey, my understanding from talking to people there, is that engineers work for the developer, the müteahhit, and deliver the design drawing. But that's where their responsibility ends. They are not requested or invited to the construction site. In the last 20 years, I believe, after the 99 earthquake, they instituted a construction reviewer system that is supposed to come to the construction site and conduct reviews. But what you can tell from my color coding is that a lot of developer companies actually formed subsidiaries that served as reviewers. So there was a lot of conflict of interest there for a while, which they remediated by instituting a lottery on who gets assigned as a reviewer. But again, the system has a lot of loopholes available. And then once the construction is done, the city is supposed to come and inspect it. Of course, the quality varies, but if you pass, you pass. Great. If you don't pass, in Turkey, unfortunately, one of the things that everybody knows is that all you have to do is wait for a building amnesty. This happens periodically whenever there's an election cycle. And it's estimated that up to 75,000 buildings across the affected zone have been given construction amnesties. This could be for a small infraction like your windows too small, too big, or it could be a big one like you added an extra floor. So I don't know if there will ever be, all of these records will ever be, studied. But again, 75,000 building amnesties is a large number to think about. There is a motion in Turkey to move towards a design reviewer that is similar to the peer review process that we have here. But that's currently only for buildings that are very tall, that are on isolators, that have very special needs like special soils. So this is something that is in the works. There are about 20, I believe, licensed design reviewers for this. So if you were building a new tall building in Istanbul, you would need to get this design reviewer, but this is not something that's going to be commonplace for an apartment building in Kahramanmaraş just yet. Some good news, Turkey has had some success. As I mentioned, the schools in the earthquake region did really well. And we expect the same for Istanbul, that has practically upgraded all of their school buildings in Istanbul with funding from the World Bank. This has cost over 2.3 billion euros. But again, the success is that over 1,000 buildings were replaced or retrofitted under this program. So it can be done. Quickly, what's next? This is the picture I had shown about the migration out of the earthquake area. That's only 1.1 million people, where we said that 2.7 million housing units were affected, or 2.7 million people were affected with their housing. So they built a ton of tent cities and container cities. At the time I wrote this, I believe 1.5 million people were living in tent cities, and somebody I spoke to yesterday said that they saw container cities everywhere, many of them sitting empty because a lot of people actually did not return to the earthquake area. However, another thing to think about is that the moment they put up these container cities, of rainstorms came into to the earthquake area, and then they had flooding that was affecting the tent cities as well. So it's just a disaster on top of disaster. Insurance information, this might be something that you guys are interested in. Turkey actually has a compulsory insurance program for private dwellings. And what I've heard is that the way they make it compulsory is that you cannot get your electricity or your cable connected unless you have insurance. So that's something we should think about here in California. It was initiated in 2000, again, after the 1999 earthquake. And the penetration is quite good, 66% in the Marmara region, that's where Istanbul is, and about 54% in the country. At the time I read this, they had a claims paying capacity of approximately $5 billion, and they were feeling pretty confident that they could cover the what's required of them in the earthquake area. And the other thing I found out later is that the reason they have so much money available is that this insurance includes the entire country. So Istanbul is where the real high risk is, because it has a high hazard and 20 million people live in Istanbul. So they kind of, they have all this money to cover the whole country. So they're gonna pay off the earthquake now. But what if there's an earthquake tomorrow in Istanbul? That's the part I worry about, both for my community, but also, of course, for the insurance institution. There's a lot of rebuilding ongoing right now. Again, in May, we had elections, so there was a very accelerated desire to reconstruct buildings so that they could tell people, look, I'm taking care of you. So there's been promises made that over 300,000 housing units will be completed by the end of this year. Students is something, of course, many of us think about. This was a statistics I found that by the end of February, so 2.5 weeks after the earthquake, 100,000 students had been transferred. And then by April, they were boasting that about 30,000 students returned. So of course, any continuation is great, but I do want to point out the discrepancy here is that 70% of the kids, which also means their parents, did not return to the area as of last month. And those who did were being taught in tent schools because the schools did well structurally, they were using them as shelter, so they had to continue teaching in tents. So it's really hard to continue education in this post-disaster environment. My quick takeaways are, what are next for engineering and other things we need to think about. The ground motions are going to be updated in Turkey and everywhere else. Non-structural component bracing became so important in hospitals that I showed you, that they would have been fine, they would have been operational if the non-structural components had been braced, but that's not part of the provisions in Turkey. Urban planning is something I hope they think about as they rebuild, because you can't just plant buildings back to where they were before. There are some known earthquake hazard zones where they should not be building, and also even in a non-hazard environment, you need to think about what you're rebuilding and what type of green space you provide. I'm really hoping, and I have a couple irons in the fire for this, that I'm really hoping that we can come up with some simple retrofitting solutions for the remaining millions of reinforced concrete buildings in Turkey. And if we could do this, this is also useful to many other countries, right? San Francisco, I'm sure Canada as well. There's a lot of older concrete buildings that need retrofitting solutions, but what's required by codes is a little expensive. It's a little too much for people to do it voluntarily. So I'm hoping that we can identify some simple, ugly, but robust solutions that can be done en masse. We also, of course, have to educate consumers, and that's definitely happening. I overheard locals talk about shear walls, weight-bearing columns, so they have a lot of new information that they now care about. So I hope that they demand that in addition to, or in lieu of granite countertops in their new kitchen. And we also have to really make sure that the engineers have accountability for their designs, and that can be provided by starting this professional engineering certification and providing review on their work. So that is the end of my presentation, and I welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Ayse. That's I always find these postmortems fascinating, but also extraordinarily disturbing and downright sad in many cases. We are opening the floor to questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, not the chat function, but the separate Q&A function if you can. I'm going to start the ball rolling, though, as I usually do. Ayse, let's talk building code. So you mentioned building code. You know, the literature is very clear on the importance of building code. Building, places where there's strong building code, there's greater survivability, less damage, and places recover much faster. Building code in and of itself is not enough, though. It has to be accompanied with compliance and inspection regimes and things like that, which is one of the things that was really sorely lacking in the area under being impacted. In the media here in North America, we heard of a city called, is it Erzin or Erzin?
Erzin, yes.
That performed very well, and that's because they made the decision a long time ago to not only comply with the building code, but also to inspect and to things like that. Do you have any comments about about that and about how that community did much better than surrounding communities?
Yes. This building right here is actually in Erzin. So we heard the exact same news, and we were like, okay, how can that happen? Like, oops, sorry. The news, the headlines were like, no damage. And then the news reports talked about the mayor being very strict about building height. One of the things he said was that I will not let anything above 3 stories built in my city, even if it's my uncle. So he was very vocal about that. You will note that this building is 5 stories tall. So we went there, and it is true. Most of the city, except for these 2 newest buildings that are the first time they're allowing 5 or 6 stories tall, every building here was about 3 stories tall. The ground shaking was lower. So again, it's kind of like I talked about, where you take points away. It seemed like here they just kind of had a couple good things going for them. And then we got to talk to the construction foreman at this site. And before we talked to him, we walked around, and they were doing really high quality construction. And then we talked to him, and he said, oh yeah, we've done about 150 buildings in this city, right? So we came across high quality construction in a city with height restrictions. and the contractor that has done majority of the construction. So they had good quality. The market was supporting good quality construction with some restrictions on the rules in a low shaking area. So things went well for them. And there was minor damage here and there, but definitely nothing like what we saw in everywhere else in the region.
It's very fascinating. Sometimes it just begins with the decision, and the decision in Erzin was to comply with the code and go even further than that. So it's really, really fascinating. But it does reinforce that the notion that building codes matter. They matter greatly. You mentioned how well the schools performed, and why was that? Was it a matter of retrofit? Was it a matter of quality construction from the get-go? Hospitals as well, like post-disaster structures seem to have done quite well. What was the reasons there? What were the reasons there?
So the reason there is that school structures, especially, are never tall, right? They definitely have this. They're much more regular in footprint. They're mostly a box. They're rarely taller than 3, maybe 4 or 5 stories tall. And they also have a lot of walls because they want to they separate classrooms. So it's just the inherent advantage of school buildings to seismic resistance. And also the unofficial anecdotal description is that people steal less when they have a contract with the government. So it's not that the official review cycle is any better for schools. There isn't a path for that, but they might not steal from the concrete. They might not steal from the steel just to make a quick buck, because it's a government contract, which is also probably a little more generous than build me an apartment building quick, because we're gonna turn that into profit.
Interesting. Just a reminder to everybody, the floor is open to anybody who wants to ask a question. Just use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, not the chat box, but the Q&A. We still don't have anything in there yet, but feel free. Lessons for a place like Canada, okay, Western industrialized G7 country. What can we learn from a place like Turkey, like a place like Syria? That Western Canada has the same seismic risk as the Pacific Northeast and the United States and other places. What can we take away from Turkey and learn from here?
My first takeaway is, because I've been speaking mostly to engineering audiences, is that the work we do is really valuable, right? It definitely feels like, and I don't mean designing buildings is important, but one of the other things that civil engineers do and dedicate a lot of their time, a lot of times unfunded, is to the development of the building codes. So the process in the US, and I apologize, I'm not as familiar with the Canadian process, but the process in the US is that it's a volunteer committee that sits together for 6 years to work through all the nitty-gritty details of developing the building code. And a lot of times that's also supported by research. And that's actually what my organization, Applied Technology Council, does, right? You mentioned that we are applied research. What we do is we bring practitioners and researchers together and say, you know what, there's this thing we want to solve. We have several products right now on this type of older concrete building. We say it's too expensive to evaluate these buildings. Let's develop a way to do it faster. And researchers say, I can do that, but I need a supercomputer and 3 grad students. And then the practitioner says, I don't have time for that. So we work together to bring them to a solution that pleases everyone. And then that goes through a very thorough consensus process, and then it comes out as building code. And what that does is that it makes sure that the solution is usable, but also easily acceptable by the practitioners who are going to do it, because they were part of development of the building code. Turkey has excellent building codes on paper, and they're very good on paper because they are slightly copied and pasted from other countries. not always considering all of the adaptations that are necessary for the specific buildings in Turkey and for the Turkish building professional technical capacity. What I hinted in my presentation was that you could do nonlinear response history analysis, but can they, right? Do they have the right education, the right tools to do that? That part is a little bit more of a question mark in Turkey than it is in the United States. So that's kind of my main thing, is that this work we do with voluntary development, voluntary participation in development of building codes is really important, because it also comes with buy-in, not just quality of the building code. The other thing we need to take away from it is that, again, I don't want this to be scary, right? We don't want to tell people like, oh my God, this could happen in our cities tomorrow. This level of devastation can happen in our cities tomorrow. It may not be this bad, but even with, a building like this, maybe where no one died, we don't want even that building, because if that level of damage happens, it will really disrupt your business district and your home prices. So we really do have to take from this that if we have vulnerable buildings in our communities, we have to take action to remediate them. And building codes are excellent, but building codes mostly affect how we design new buildings. They don't apply retroactively. And it's really rare for a jurisdiction to have a program that says, okay, now we got to fix our older buildings. A lot of people, if you're sitting in a building right now, that is an existing building. That means it's already outdated. So we got to keep it up. So we have to have these seismic retrofit programs in our cities, which are really rare and really difficult politically to get through, because of course it requires money, it requires tenant displacement. But I think if we can all keep in mind the impacts on the business side and on the community side, we can motivate ourselves to do some good retrofits.
I think, kind of part and parcel with that is this issue of labeling buildings or tagging buildings. And, there's a discussion going on in Los Angeles, San Francisco. And, you put a warning on a building that this building is unreinforced masonry or something of that nature. But some issues have been brought forward that will stigmatize a building and will end up impacting people in perhaps low income individuals, public housing, and those people will be harmed financially and otherwise. What's your view on labeling buildings or tagging buildings for hazard?
I wear two hats, right? As an engineer, those are the facts. If a building is structurally vulnerable, it is important to know it, and so that we can take action on it. And that's of course where it becomes complicated from a political point of view to say, you can't just say, okay, if you have score X, everybody must fix their own buildings, because yes, there's inequities in who can afford to and who cannot. So I think that's an area where the proper financing solutions have to be made available, so that everybody can achieve strong, safer buildings, for their occupants. So definitely, it's just a very, very delicate balance between, again, scaring people off, or keeping silent. So I'm definitely in the side of, we have to, if I know something about the vulnerability of your building, it is my responsibility to work with you to remediate that. So I'm very involved in similar activities in my community, and I'm very optimistic that we will find the right solutions that will make most of the people happy, or equally.
Very good. You've talked a little bit about building materials and so on, but a question from an attendee is the difference in building materials used in Turkey and the difference in building materials used in places like Canada or the United States. What are some of the major differences in the building materials used, and how would this difference in materials have impacted the outcomes or the casualties?
the number one difference that is intentionally there is the use of the unreinforced hollow clay tile. We saw this in Istanbul in the 1999 earthquake. We saw it. It's this, this stuff. And I remember in 1999, we were just resting, and I took a piece of pebble and threw it at one of these tiles, and the wall just shattered. Right, it was so thin, with a pebble, it just broke. So every time I was talking to an engineer, I talked to them about, like, is there any way we don't use these heavy but unreinforced clay tiles that, again, fall on people's heads, cause fear, fall on your property and cause damage. But that does not seem to be a thing that they want to consider. And of course, they're claiming financial reasons for that. Anything steel is very, very costly in Turkey, and the price goes up. There's, I think, especially with inflation right now, but the steel is imported so that, by the time you bid for a project, the price of the steel may have gone up so much, so they do not like using it. So whereas here we would use gypsum board and steel studs to use as our partition walls, they use the tile. And of course, it's also good for heat insulation, but that's a really big difference that we do not see in Western United States and in Canada. As for the quality of the materials, that's definitely a big concern. As I mentioned, people seem to make a lot of shortcuts for themselves on the material side. So ironically, all of the evaluation methodologies in Istanbul or in Turkey right now, they're obsessed with taking concrete samples. If you have an older building that's already weak, I believe the rule is like, I don't know, 6 core samples per floor. And I'm saying this in jest, but like, by the time you make so many holes in a vulnerable building, he probably made it even weaker by the time you're done with the evaluation. So concrete quality definitely varies a lot. We heard a lot of anecdotes about just really, really weak concrete. So that's a big issue. And reducing the number of steel that the design required and not putting it all in is another anecdote we heard a lot. I've heard of anecdotes like, oh yeah, there's no way I could pour my concrete if I put all that steel in, so I just reduced it by half. Those are firsthand stories I've heard from construction workers.
Amazing. Another question, do you have any observations regarding kind of public infrastructure, water lines, sanitary sewer, storm lines, electrical power supply, gas lines, and things of that nature? Any commentary there?
Not many, because they did pretty well. So as I mentioned, at some point, the road infrastructure did well. So that was actually my first task. Just sitting at my desk was to look at the transportation network. I was monitoring Twitter, and there really wasn't much. There was one tunnel that was closed due to some spalling. It opened the next day. And then, as my colleague told me yesterday, she talked to the Ministry of Transportation, and they said, okay, we had 15 moderate damage to abutments, but they were all, repaired enough to be reopened within 36 hours. So transportation network did great. Electric power, we heard of very little damage to it. So I mean, these are kind of the big picture on the networks. That said, as I mentioned for Antakya, they did lose water. In Maraş, they lost water from the main for 5 days. So I think within cities, there were losses to the water and gas and power infrastructure, but kind of overall distribution systems did quite well. One of the things that definitely failed was communication. One lesson that I learned from here is that the cell towers that we all rely on for our communication, need power, and their backup power, I believe, is 2 days max. And in this case, they lost electricity for 5 days, so people would lose cell tower connectivity, which was very, very important. Another thing I did not see, which I was expecting, and that's something I highly expect in San Francisco, is fire following earthquakes. But it didn't happen partly because the buildings are concrete, right? They're not wood frame buildings like the ones we have here. Another one I heard was that there was one rupture in one of the gas lines, and the lifelines report from EERI has pictures of it. They actually, there was a gas rupture in the main, so that means probably the city couldn't get gas, and then if there's no gas, then you can't have those fires. So that was actually a positive thing that I observed. The airport infrastructure struggled a little bit. There was a brand new airport that had been built in Hatay on a lake bed, so the runway liquefied, so they had to fix that. But again, about a week after the earthquake, everything was functioning again. So the EERI report will have a lot more details on specifically lifelines, dams, and things like that. So.
Okay. Any commentary on the insurance side? There are a couple of questions regarding insurance, not your area of expertise,
Yeah.
but you know, one question was, did the insurance cover the cost of the rebuilds or just partially? And does the insurance industry have any influence over, you know, building code, inspection, things of that nature?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the details of it very much. One thing I am seeing though that it does seem different than the US, at least, is that it's the government that is rebuilding these buildings. But I don't know how that plays with insurance. There is insurance, as I mentioned, there is insurance penetration, better than here. But unfortunately, I'm not very clear about who's paying for rebuilding of 300,000 units within a year.
Fair enough. Any notable signs of liquefaction, liquefied soil? I think you did mention it, especially that
Yes.
one community that was built on a lake bed. And we know all too well in Canada what happens when you build on an ancient lake bed from the flood side of things. But this individual said saw photos of buildings leaning over, but wonder if it was due to the soils or inadequate foundation design.
That picture could have been inadequate foundation design. However, there were many signs of liquefaction. We were there a little later. You know, we were there on day 10 and on. Our geotechnical colleagues, so that was the other thing. My team was structure focused, and we were paired with a geotechnical team. They had many observations of fault rupture and liquefaction. There was the town of Iskenderun, which is it's a port town. It's located right here. So that port had, sand boils with many meters in diameter, you know, in the space where they keep their containers, and the port was closed for a while. So there were many geotechnical effects of liquefaction in that area. So again, the EERI report would spell those out.
Great. Just on one note, just for attendees, ICLR has been involved in a very large project with British Columbia. And later on this year into next, there will be a release of about 19 new maps. These are microzonation maps of the Vancouver and area. The maps will be for soils, liquefaction, and landslide. So keep an eye out for that. And when the time comes to release those, we'll probably be having a Friday forum and things like that. So that's coming for the Vancouver and area for Canada. I have no other questions in the box, and I'm out myself. So I think we'll probably, we got one popped up right here. Hang on. Oh, no, it's just a thank you for a great presentation. So I just want to echo that. Ayse, thank you so much. It was very fascinating. You did a great job. Again, eye-opening, but also very disturbing. Thank you so much for this excellent work. Hope to hear from you again in the future. Thanks to all the attendees, and keep an eye out for the note for the next Friday forum on July 14th. We're talking about developing a coherent flood forecasting framework for Canada. So again, thank you. Thanks to attendees, and everybody have a great Canada Day weekend, and take care.